Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from the city of Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And today, on the Jazz Flashes podcast, we're going to profile one of the greatest jazz trombonists of all time. And this has to do with an article that I recently wrote about the great Jack Teagarden for Bing magazine, the periodical publication of the International Club Crosby, dedicated to maintaining the legacy and honoring the work and the life and the contributions to music of the great singer Bing Crosby. And one of Bing Crosby's associates was Jack Teagarden. Jack Teagarden, who apparently did not like his given name. It seems that Weldon Leo Teagarden didn't like his given name much. No, because as soon as he decided to become a professional musician, he changed it to Jack Teagarden. And under that name, he would be known as one of the best and most innovative trombonists of the 1920s, 30s, and beyond. So important, in fact, is his figure in the development of the jazz trombone that it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Teagarden did for that instrument, for the trombone, something comparable to what Louis Armstrong himself did for the cornet and the trumpet. But before his arrival in New York City at the end of 1927, before dazzling musicians and listeners alike with his technique on the trombone, even before changing his name, Jack Teagarden had a rather difficult childhood and underwent a long period of learning and musical evolution. Very long period. Jack Teagarden was born in Vernon, Texas, a city known for being one of the two Lone Star State towns chosen by singer Vernon Dalhart to fashion his stage name. Vernon Dalhart was one of the pioneers in country music, even though he could sing and he actually recorded all kinds of music, from pop to light opera to, yes, some of the earliest country music records. Well, his real name was Marion Try Slaughter, and he fashioned a stage name by using the name of two Texas towns, Vernon and Dalhart. Well, in Vernon, Jack Teagarden was born, and he benefited from the musical interest shown by many members of his family. Both his father and his mother could play instruments, but it was particularly his mother that would exert a long-lasting influence on young Jack, still known then as Weldon, of course. Two of his sisters and his younger brother Charlie Teagarden, were interested in music, and Jack started on the piano when he was 5. But by age 10, he had switched to the trombone. His ear for music was outstanding, but his interest in mechanics naturally led him to further explore the technical possibilities of the trombone, thereby creating a personal, highly recognizable style that would in time set him apart from all the other trombonists. Tragedy struck when Teagarden was 13, as his father succumbed to the flu, and so his mother was forced to move the family to Oklahoma City. It wouldn't be very long before Jack decided to leave the family home, so by the time he was 15, he had already become a professional musician. It was around these teenage years that he changed his name to Jack Teagarden and returned to Texas, where he played with different kinds of orchestras, refining his style and incorporating elements of New Orleans jazz and the blues, especially whenever these bands were touring in the Mississippi and Louisiana area. Teagarden's 1921 encounter with pianist Peck Kelly can only be described as momentous, particularly because of Kelly's interest in the blues, and his association with trombonist Vic Gaspard brought him even closer to the idiom of New Orleans jazz. The young Jack's reputation began to grow steadily as he kept playing with these combinations, and his style and technique continued to evolve and improve. It was also around this time that he started to sing, fashioning a blues-drenched style that would prove extremely successful when he decided to move to New York City. His arrival in New York in 1927 is one of the milestones not just of his career, but I would argue of 1920s jazz as well. It wasn't an easy place to make the big time either. The New York jazz community boasted some of the greatest musical talent of the era. Musicians like Miff Mole, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Red Nichols, and Eddie Lang, among many others. In his book Jazz Masters of the 20s, critic Richard Hadlock talks about Teagarden's arrival in New York in terms of a veritable musical revolution. Well, so innovative, advanced, and attractive was his style at that point that Teagarden was recognized as a mature jazz trombonist with ideas well in advance of those of most of his contemporaries. Those are words of Richard Hadlock, and I totally agree with that critic's opinion. If you have a CD compilation like BG and Big T in NYC, you will be able to hear that Jack Teagarden's recorded output in these years, the late 1920s, was very large and included work with bands led by the likes of Adrian Rollini, Red Nichols, Irving Mills, Joe Venuti, and Eddie Lang, among several others. Even some of the most successful bands of the period were employing him at this point, and so his name crops up on recordings by Roger Wolf Kahn, Eddie Condon, Hoagy Carmichael, Ted Lewis, Sam Lanning, and Ben Pollack. And that last name, drummer Ben Pollack, is very important. His association with Pollack, in fact, would be long and prolific. And this association has led critic Dan Morgenstern to compare him with Benny Goodman because of Teagarden's increasing fame in New York at this time. In Morgenstern's view, both Benny Goodman and Jack Teagarden stood out because they were extraordinarily gifted instrumentalists, fully in touch with the developing language of jazz. It is impossible, listening to these recordings, not to agree with Dan Morgenstern. Jack Teagarden was very much in demand in New York at this time, and many of the bands with which he played and recorded were somehow associated with the Pollack Orchestra, with Ben Pollack. Think about this. In 1929 alone, the trombonist appeared on over 100 recordings, including sides on which he is featured alongside soloists of the stature of Louis Armstrong, Eddie Condon, Eddie Lang, Fats Waller, and Red Allen. Even after the stock market crashed that year, Jack Teagarden managed to keep entering the recording studios quite regularly, though it is true that the effects of the economic crisis on the recording industry will eventually catch up with him. In 1932, for example, he wasn't booked for a single session, and by the end of the following year, he made the decision to leave the Pollack organization for good and look for better opportunities. His style, influenced by the blues, as always, kept changing and evolving, and toward the mid-1930s, Teagarden began to show interest in ballad singing and he recorded, among other examples, a lovely vocal rendition of 100 Years from Today, one of his best remembered slow numbers, and really one of my favorite performances by Jack Teagarden, one of my favorite of all time. Possibly looking for some financial security, which makes a lot of sense, in 1934, Teagarden signed a long-term contract with none other than Paul Weidman, and he spent almost the rest of the 30s playing the kind of symphonic jazz that had made Weidman world famous. Unfortunately, Teagarden rarely got to play the kind of jazz he loved throughout these years, which was probably disheartening to him, and this led critic Otis Ferguson to observe at the time that, and these are Ferguson's words, though still a fine musician, Jack Teagarden seems tired and cynical, his creation a bit shop-worn. Well, it's true that once in a while, Weidman gave Teagarden some jazzier solo spots. And he even got the chance to participate in small group recording sessions with the likes of Benny Goodman, Teddy Wilson, Pee Wee Russell, and Eddie Condon. It isn't hard to imagine, though, how relieved Jack Teagarden must have felt once the contract ran out at the end of 1938. Needless to say, he didn't renew it and began looking for opportunities to play the kind of music that he deeply loved. By this time, the late 1930s, the new swing music was reaching the height of its popularity. And so Jack Teagarden decided to use some of the money that he had earned with Paul Weidman to form his own swing band. Musically, that may have sounded like a great idea, and it really was from a musical standpoint. But the trouble was that Jack Teagarden was no businessman, and though it was artistically excellent, this first band was soon running the risk of bankruptcy. Therefore, Teagarden decided to reduce its size, and although he also began to make concessions to a more commercial sound, still not as commercial as the one he was playing with Paul Weidman, this second band ultimately failed as well and was severely under-recorded, which is really too bad. Reedman Leon Radsliff would later reminisce about his time with the band in the early 1940s. And these are the words of Leon Radsliff. He said, "Jack was a good musical leader, but he was no businessman. He seemed to be more interested in steam engines than publicity, and his managers played him for a sucker." Well, when it came to their musical component, Teagarden's bands were always outstanding, and at the beginning of the 40s, it looked like he was going full speed ahead. Not only did he sign a recording contract with Decca, although the AFM ban around that time caused the band to record very scarcely, unfortunately, but he also appeared in the 1941 film Birth of the Blues, starring Bing Crosby. Jack Teagarden had known Crosby since the early years, when the singer was working with Weidman. And the movie yielded some worthwhile recordings, such as, for example, The Waiter, the Porter, and the Upstairs Maid. Moreover, starting in 1941, Teagarden guested on Crosby's extremely popular radio show on several occasions. And some of these appearances have survived and can be heard on releases, like the Swinging with Bing box set. That's an outstanding box set of radio recordings by Bing Crosby that includes, among others, Jack Teagarden. Throughout his career, Bing Crosby had always felt most at home when performing in the Dixieland style that he associated with his youth, and his love of jazz ensured that jazz greats such as Red Nichols, Joe Venuti, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, and Jack Teagarden himself often guested on his radio programs. On such occasions, the atmosphere is always one of camaraderie, friendship, and sheer musical fun. Besides his association with Bing in the 1940s, Teagarden also had a chance to participate in countless small group jazz recording sessions that teamed him up with excellent musicians such as Barney Bigard, Ben Webster, Bobby Hackett, Coleman Hawkins, Rex Stewart, and the always elegant vocalist Lee Wiley. And some of these sides are among the best in his entire output. In fact, when it comes to listening to Jack Teagarden, I would say that I much prefer the recordings that he made in a small group jazz setting. Unfortunately, by the end of the decade, Teagarden's health began to show signs of failing, mostly due to alcohol-related problems. He managed to keep playing in both New York and California. And in 1947, while undergoing financial difficulties, Bing Crosby, none other than Bing Crosby, came to the rescue. Jay Smith and Len Guttridge elaborate on this story in the biography they co-wrote about the trombonist. And this is absolutely necessary reading. Jack Teagarden, The Story of a Jazz Maverick. Smith and Guttridge say in that book, in the spring of 1947, Jack Teagarden was unemployed and in debt when he received a message from Bing Crosby to call at his office the following day. Bing was well aware of Jack's troubles, and when Jack said he could not make a fresh start in California, Bing suggested that he should pick up where he had left off in New York. He then had a check made out to Jack for $600 for, as he put it, some fares and some snacks. When Teagarden assured him that the loan would not be for long, he was told with a smile, "I know, you'll pay me back. Make sure that you do. I need the dough, son." That's Bing Crosby's typical humor. Well, for the rest of his life, Teagarden would tell anyone who cared to listen that this generous gesture from Bing Crosby saved both his life and his career. As a matter of fact, things began to look up for Jack when just a few months later, he joined an all-star band led by his friend Louis Armstrong. And with Satchmo, he toured extensively, and the many live recordings that were made of their music show that everyone involved in this project was having a great deal of fun in these concerts. The 50s would be a calmer period for Teagarden. He was by now a highly respected musician, was sent to Asia by the U.S. Department of State as a jazz ambassador, and worked on slowly overcoming his health issues. These are the years of the Dixieland revival, which is the reason why he concentrated on this type of jazz. But in reality, his music defied labels. And in the early 60s, he recorded two of his best albums, Misery and the Blues from 1961 and Think Well of Me from 1962. Both of them absolutely recommendable, and both of them produced by Creed Taylor and released on Verve Records. The latter, Think Well of Me, is a kind of songbook devoted to the compositions of the lesser-known Willard Robison, with whom Teagarden had worked in the 1920s and 1930s. These are highly mature albums, perfect examples of the high level that his music had reached after all those decades as a professional musician. Listening to them, it's easy to understand why later jazzmen of the stature of Herbie Green, Bob Brookmeyer, Stan Getz, and Al Cohn thought so highly of him, even musicians who were not playing the trombone. Some of them were, but some of them weren't, and they were still influenced by the style and the music of Jack Teagarden. One of Jack Teagarden's last recordings took place at the 1963 Monterey Jazz Festival, and it turned out to be a sort of family reunion that included, along with Pee Wee Russell, his trumpeter brother Charlie, his sister Norma, and even his mother, who played piano. A few weeks after this festival gig, which, by the way, can be found on a CD release, Jack Teagarden passed away on January 15th, 1964, aged 58, way too young, in a hotel room in New Orleans. Jack Teagarden was such an influential musician that assessing his importance in the development of the jazz trombone proves a very difficult task. I think it's better to listen to his recorded legacy throughout the decades, in particular in those blues-tinged small group jazz sessions that he cut between the 1920s and the 1940s, to understand how much any jazz trombonist owes to the work of Big T. And I would say that those recordings from the 20s, 30s, and 40s are essential listening, along with those two albums from the early 60s, Misery and the Blues and Think Well of Me. Those are the two ways to get acquainted with the music of Jack Teagarden. The early side of his output, and then the more mature, later side of his recorded legacy. As bassist Harry Goodman once stated, Teagarden owned the trombone. The trombone didn't own him. Very wise words, because that is absolutely true. He owned the trombone. The trombone did not own him. Jerry Mulligan, who again wasn't a trombonist but knew what he was talking about when it came to jazz, described Teagarden's musicianship perhaps better than anyone else. And this is what Jerry Mulligan said about Jack Teagarden once. He had everything a great jazz musician needs to have: a beautiful sound, a wonderful melodic sense, a deep feeling, a swinging beat, and the ability to make everything, even the most difficult things, sound relaxed and easy. Well, in that sense, there's little doubt that both Mulligan himself and Bing Crosby learned a great deal from the trombonist. Jack Teagarden was described very appropriately once by the French critic Alain Tercinet in these words. Tercinet described Jack Teagarden as the large, amiable Texan with the Cheshire cat grin. And with that description, I will leave you, simply inviting you to listen to the music of Jack Teagarden, the records that he made in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the radio appearances with Bing Crosby, and there are several of those. And of course, the records that he made in the early 1960s, Misery and the Blues and Think Well of Me, released on Verve Records. The music of Jack Teagarden is an absolute treasure, and along with my invitation to listen to Jack Teagarden, I also invite you to leave comments underneath this video to let me know what you think about the music of Jack Teagarden, if you are a fan. Why do you think that Jack Teagarden is an important figure in the history of jazz, and what records do you prefer by the great Jack Teagarden? My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and this episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast, devoted to the music, to the figure, to the legacy of Jack Teagarden, is coming to an end. Thank you for listening, and now it's time to grab a record by Jack Teagarden and play it any way you want, on vinyl, on CD, on some streaming device. It doesn't matter. It'll be a great experience because, in the case of Jack Teagarden, as it is the case with the greatest recordings in the history of jazz, well, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing as Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington once said. Thanks for listening. Thanks for any kind of comment that you might wish to leave underneath this video. And right now, I'm signing off from Jackson, Tennessee, in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. Anton Garcia Fernandez signing off and saying, so long, everybody.